Joining us now in studio, Chris Hedges, author of Death of the Liberal Class, and we welcome you, I think, our first Pulitzer Prize winning author on this program. I think so. Regardless, we're happy to have you here. Let's go through some of these definitions, make sure we're all talking about the same thing. What is the liberal class that you refer to?
It is defined by the liberal institutions, a couple of which you mentioned. The liberal religious institutions, primarily the church, universities, of course, labor unions. In the United States, that would be the Democratic Party. In Canada, that would be the Liberal Party. These are institutions which, while certainly compromised with the power elite, often making concessions, which sometimes are morally questionable, nevertheless provided mechanisms of reform, possibilities of change, channels of change within established democratic structures, so that when you had movements of massive discontent, whether that was the Great Depression in the 1930s, whether in my own country, the Civil Rights Movement, the anti-war movement, you had vehicles by which this discontent could be expressed within the system and bring about reform.
You want to give a good, maybe a little further example of how these institutions have protected liberal democracies in the past?
Well, I think that the perfect example in the United States would be the New Deal, where you in essence had the collapse of capitalism, and you had, and Roosevelt was not a radical figure. He was a figure, there were radical movements. Of course, the Communist Party was fairly strong up until the end of the 1930s in the United States. You had radical unions, the CIO, and in many ways what Roosevelt did was step in on behalf of the capitalist class to save it. That would be a perfect example of how liberal institutions have a kind of modus operandi with a business or a corporate elite.
And you know who agrees with you on that? Conrad Black, right, who wrote a glowing tome about Roosevelt. It's always for you the Democratic Party and never the Republican Party that does this. How come?
Well, traditionally, although this has changed, the Republican Party represented the interests of the more moneyed and conservative elite. The Democratic Party, at least until the presidency of Bill Clinton, cared about the interests of the working class, as well as the underclass, those people who needed welfare, social support systems. That changed, and quite consciously, in the 1990s when the Democratic Party, led by Clinton, realized that it too could serve corporate interests and take corporate money. And by the 90s, the late 90s, the Democrats had fundraising parity with the Republicans in terms of corporate money. And then by the presidential election, which saw Barack Obama assume office, they got more. But of course, they had to do corporate bidding. And that meant betraying the very liberal values that traditionally were part of the party. So we had NAFTA, we had so-called welfare reform, we had the deregulation of the banking system, which you've not done in Canada, and that we're now seeing over 100 bank collapses a year, huge zombie banks like Citibank. We're now going through a massive mortgage fraud crisis, and all of this was put in place not just by the Republicans, but by the Democrats.
It's interesting, though, because when you look back at the 1990s that you've just referenced, Mr. and Mrs. Everyday America remembers that as being a very good time for them, not just for the interests you're decrying, but the budgets were balanced, services were good, people had jobs. There seems like there's a disconnect. I know you've got a real mad on for Bill Clinton. There's no question that comes through. But don't Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Front Porch have a bit of a love on for Bill Clinton right now because they think he did defend their interests during good times?
Well, that's the popular perception, but it's just factually not true. Even in my own business, I was working for the New York Times, the deregulation of the FCC, which has resulted in essence a half dozen corporations, Viacom, Disney, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, controlling just about everything at this point most Americans see, watch, or listen to. And that was all Clinton. Let's not forget that real wages in the United States have been on a steady decline since the early 1970s. And what sustained a level of consumption and a lifestyle was credit. And now with the banking collapse, that credit has dried up. That the jobs that we lost by the destruction of our manufacturing base are not coming back. Lawrence Summers, the economic advisor in the Obama White House, and of course the Treasury Secretary under Clinton, who orchestrated much of this deregulation, tacitly admits this when he talks of a jobless recovery. So we are now reaping the consequences of a series of policies which served a corporate oligarchy or a corporate elite at the expense of what at this point has become a disenfranchised working class.
Let's talk about one of the other pillars, mass media. You say the mass media is letting us down, and I wonder what won't the media write about that, that therefore is not serving our liberal democracy well?
Well, I think unlike Canada, we have to make a clear demarcation between the electronic media in the United States and the print media. You still have, and you're an example of this, serious programs on electronic media that's all been obliterated. Our public television station has been utterly gutted. The last show on there that dealt with issues of power, Bill Moyle's journal, has now been taken off the air. Bill's retired and not been replaced. And so we have, in essence, there's been an utter corruption of journalism on the commercial networks. It's all celebrity gossip and trivia and tawdry soap operas built around politicians and their love mistresses, or Tiger Woods sex tapes or whatever. And in the print media is, of course, dying because that traditional role of newsprint, which connected buyers with sellers, has been obliterated with vehicles of electronic information or the dissemination of information that no longer gives them a monopoly. And so they have become even more craven. There's always been within, and I spent 15 years at the New York Times, I think a too comfortable relationship on the part of major news organizations like the New York Times with the elite. I mean, so much of what they build their status on is accessibility. And of course, during the Bush administration, they had plenty of accessibility to the Bush White House, but they ended up essentially disseminating the lies that were used to justify the Iraq War. Or we can look at the financial meltdown, which the newspaper utterly missed, despite a very robust business section, because they relied for their information on Robert Rubin at Citibank and the heads of Goldman Sachs, instead of going out into poor neighborhoods where subprime mortgages were being shoved down the throats of people who the banks knew could not repay.
We talked Bill Clinton, let's talk Barack Obama. Barack Obama, in the not quite 2 years he's been president, has brought in an unprecedented health care package. He got a massive stimulus package through the Congress, a financial deregulation package, not deregulation, excuse me, re-regulation package. Is he rebuilding the pillars in a way that you would find favorable?
No, I think Barack Obama has been a disaster. Let's take the so-called health care reform bill, which is about $400 billion in subsidies to the for-profit healthcare industry. In essence, it is the insurance and pharmaceuticals equivalent of the bank bailout. Let's talk about the bailout that you mentioned. The problem is that all of that money went into the hands of financial speculators who caused the problem to begin with, who are not lending the money. There is no credit. And we have liberal economists, including Paul Krugman at the New York Times, who keep saying, well, we need another bailout, because we have to give money to create jobs.
Another stimulus, you mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's not going to happen.
No.
So we lost our chance. And I think Barack Obama has proved feckless and weak. He, in essence, what the Democratic administration has done is codified the destruction of domestic and international law that was put in place by the Bush administration. I mean, remember, he's not even restored habeas corpus.
Are you comparing him to the Almighty or the alternative? We had a prime minister here named Brian Mulroney who used to say that all the time. Don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative. He's better than that, isn't he?
I think that if you look at the structural embrace or the structure of the Obama administration, it is not in any way remarkably different from the Bush administration and would not have been any different from the McCain administration. And that's when we get to what Sheldon Wolin calls our great political philosopher from Berkeley and Princeton, calls the system of inverted totalitarianism, that in essence we have undergone, or to steal a line from John Ralston, we have undergone a kind of coup d'etat in slow motion. And I think that's right, that I think the levers of power are so corrupted that the citizenry has been disempowered. Remember that the first bailout plan, $700 billion proposed for Congress, was opposed across the political spectrum. Constituent calls were 100 to 1 against it. Some of the most impassioned speeches against it were delivered by far-right Republicans from Texas, and yet it passed anyway. Why? Because the corporations wanted it passed.
Well, the Treasury Secretary got down his hands and
and
knees
the
and kissed Nancy
well, there
Pelosi's
you go.
ring, and that's how it got through.
His worth was wrapped up in about $500 million in Goldman Sachs.
No one mentioned that at the time,
Yeah,
right?
right. There you go.
Has there ever been, in your view, a dismantling of the liberal class in history? An out-and-out dismantling?
Not so much dismantling as corruption. And I think that when the liberal class or liberal institutions go bankrupt, and this was something, that obsessed Dostoevsky. It's what Demons is about. It's what Notre Dame Underground is about. It's something that I watched in the former Yugoslavia. What, in essence, that you do is you shut off that safety valve. You shut off the possibility for reform within the system. And that's what Notre Dame Underground is about. It's about the defeated dreamer, the person who went and shouted, "Yes, we can," and voted for Barack Obama, and nothing changed, and he retreats into cynicism. And when your liberal institutions no longer function, then you enter, in Dostoevsky's words, an age of moral nihilism. And I think that's where we're headed, and I think we can already see it leaping up around the fringes of the American political establishment.
Is that the Tea Party?
The Tea Party, militias, or the lunatic fringe of the Republican Party, many of whom in a few days are going to assume positions of power.
Because you think they're going to do so well in the midterms.
Yeah.
Let me read an excerpt from the book. Michael, this graphic, if we could, please. We have entered a historical vacuum. The systems built around the old beliefs have failed, but new alternatives have yet to be articulated. The longer the power elite and the liberal class speak in words that no longer correspond to reality, the more an embittered and betrayed populace loses faith in traditional systems of government and power. The inability of liberals and the power elite to address our reality leaves the disenfranchised open to manipulation by the demagogues. Here you are. The moral nihilism Dostoevsky feared with the collapse of the liberal class inevitably leads to social chaos. Play that out for us a little bit more. I mean, you touched on what a few elements of this are going to be. Okay, the Republicans do great next Tuesday. Obama continues a downward slide. Where do you see this going?
Well, the problem is that because liberal institutions and the liberal class did not defend basic liberal values, especially a concern for the working class, much of the rage, and rage is the right word, that is being expressed through movements like the Tea Party, is directed not just at the government. And it's interesting that the manipulators of the Tea Party, like Dick Armory, have veered or deflected that rage away from Wall Street towards government, with very overt undertones of racism towards Obama. And so there's also a rage of the liberal class, which continues to speak in a language which purports to care about the interests of the working class and the middle class, and yet has served corporate interests to continue fraud and abuse and the degradation of the working class.
So in some respects, they're getting their own just desserts. Is that
I
right?
think that the rage that is justified, and I think liberals have to wake up and recognize that we should begin to articulate this rage, because if not, it is going to continue to be co-opted and channeled by essentially proto-fascist, anti-democratic movements.
We had an ex-politician in here or a few days ago actually, who said anger is not a great governing society. Anger is not a great philosophy by which to govern a society, or build a society for that matter. And yet you want to recapture some of that on the liberal side of the spectrum.
I think that we have to begin to understand what we've done to our dispossessed working class, and that it is incumbent upon us, if we care about our democracy, to re-enfranchise these workers back into the economy. And if we don't, we are going to end up with a neo-feudalistic or an oligarchic state. And look, you can go back and read Plutarch and Thucydides. You cannot maintain a democracy in an oligarchic system.
Okay, that's the thesis of Death of the Liberal Class. Chris Hedges is our guest, and coming up next on the debate, is Chris Hedges right? Has the liberal class really let us down? Stay with us.